March 31st, 1922. 6 people are preparing for sleep inside an isolated farmhouse deep in the Bavarian woods. They lock the heavy oak doors. They latch the windows against the freezing wind. They think they are alone. They have no idea that directly above their heads, in the cramped darkness of the attic, a stranger is lying in the hay, listening to them breathe. He has been there for days. He has watched them eat, listened to their secrets, and waited for this exact moment. In the next few hours, the family will be lured one by one into the barn. A heavy weapon descended from the shadows, delivering a fatal blow. The screams will be swallowed by the snow. But the death of the family isn't the end of the horror. It's only the beginning. Because here is the insane part. After slaughtering 6 people, the killer didn't run. He didn't flee into the night. He stayed. He lived among the corpses for 3 days, eating their food, sleeping in their beds, and tending to their cattle while the bodies rotted just a few yards away. How does a person live with 6 ghosts? And who was the invisible man of Hinterkaifeck? Germany, 1922. The wounds of the Great War are still bleeding. The country is in economic freefall, and the rural villages of Bavaria are places of hardship, superstition, and silence. About an hour's drive north of Munich, near the town of Schrobenhausen, lay the farmstead of Hinterkaifeck. To call it a home would be generous. It was a fortress of isolation. The farm sat about a mile away from the main village of Kaifeck, hidden behind a veil of dense pine forests known locally as the Hexenholz, the Witch's Wood. The location was desolate, exposed to the biting winds that swept across the flat, snow-covered fields. The family who lived there, the Grubers, were as cold and unforgiving as the landscape. Andreas Gruber, the 63-year-old patriarch, was a man who cast a long, dark shadow. He was wealthy, owning a significant amount of land and holding large cash reserves, but he was notoriously stingy and brutal. He was a tyrant who ruled his household with an iron fist. Neighbors whispered about his violent temper, about the beatings he inflicted on his wife, Cecilia, and about something even darker. For years, rumors had swirled through the village that Andreas was in love with his own daughter, Victoria Gabriel. Victoria was a 35-year-old widow, her husband having ostensibly died in the trenches of World War I. She had a beautiful voice and sang in the church choir, but her eyes held a profound sadness. She had 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and little Joseph, just 2 years old. The paternity of Joseph was a subject of scandalous gossip. Many in the village believed the boy was the product of the incestuous relationship between Andreas and Victoria. Andreas had even served prison time years earlier for incest, a stain that marked the family as pariahs. They were feared, disliked, and utterly alone. But in the winter of 1922, something breached their isolation. It wasn't a person at first, it was a feeling, a creeping dread that the farm was no longer theirs. The terror began slowly, months before the massacre. It started with the maid. The family employed a servant named Crescentia Rieger. She was a sturdy, hard-working woman, not prone to flights of fancy. But in late 1921, she abruptly packed her bags. She stood in the snow, trembling, her face pale with terror. She told anyone who would listen that she could not spend another night in that house. She whispered about Hinterkaifeck being haunted. She spoke of footsteps pacing in the attic above her room when no one was there. She spoke of voices whispering in empty halls, and of a malevolent, heavy presence watching her from the shadows. Andreas Gruber laughed at her. He called her hysterical and refused to pay her full wages. She left that day and never looked back. That fear saved her life. For months, the house was silent. The winter snows came, burying the farm in white. But in mid-March, the ghosts returned. And this time, they left physical proof. One morning after a fresh overnight snowfall, Andreas went out to inspect his land. He froze. Cutting across the pristine white field was a set of heavy boot prints. They were large, distinct, and purposeful. They emerged from the thick darkness of the Witch's Wood and marched in a straight line directly to the farmhouse. Andreas scanned the field. He looked for the tracks leading back to the woods. There were none. Whoever or whatever had walked out of the forest the night before had walked into the farm and never left. A logical man would have panicked. A cautious man would have searched every inch of the property or called the police, but Andreas Gruber was stubborn, arrogant, and deeply distrustful of authority. He searched the barn himself, poking through the hay with a pitchfork. He found nothing. No vagrant, no thief. He decided to wait. That night, the psychological torture began in earnest. Strange noises echoed from the attic. Heavy thuds. The creaking of floorboards directly above the bedrooms. It sounded like a man pacing back and forth, restless and heavy. But every time Andreas climbed the ladder with his lantern, the attic was empty. Just piles of hay, drying meat, and dust. Then reality started to shift. A set of keys to the main house vanished from a table in the living room. Andreas searched everywhere, but they were gone. This was critical. Without those keys, the family couldn't lock the house securely from the outside, but someone else could lock them in. A few days later, a Munich newspaper appeared in the kitchen. Andreas stared at it in confusion. It was a paper the family didn't subscribe to, and the postman hadn't delivered any mail that day. On Friday, March 31st, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived. It was her first day. She was 44 years old, a woman looking for steady work. She arrived in the afternoon, escorted by her sister. She unpacked her things in the small maid's chamber, unaware that she had walked into a trap that had been set for days. She didn't know about the footprints. She didn't know about the attic. She simply prepared for bed, exhausted from the journey. She would not survive the night. March 31st evening. The sun set early, plunging the farm into absolute darkness. The events of the next few hours have been reconstructed by detectives based on blood spatter analysis and the grim positioning of the bodies. It was a methodical, cold-blooded execution. The killer didn't break in. He didn't need to. He was already part of the household, a phantom moving through the walls, perhaps descending from the attic once the lights went out. His strategy was simple and terrifyingly effective. Separate and destroy. One by one, the family members were lured into the barn. The barn was connected to the house by a covered passageway, a dark tunnel filled with the smell of livestock and hay. This architectural detail is important. It meant the victims didn't have to go outside into the snow. They could walk from their warm kitchen directly into their graves. We don't know what drew them out. Perhaps the killer unlatched the stable doors to make the cows restless, their lowing echoing into the house. Perhaps he made a noise, mimicking an intruder or a broken machine. First came the parents, Andreas and his wife Cecilia. As they stepped from the passageway into the pitch-black barn, they were met with a violence so sudden they likely never registered the pain. A mattock, a heavy, versatile farming tool with a pickaxe on one side and an adze blade on the other, swung down from the darkness. One blow, silence. The killer dragged the bodies into a corner, stacking them and covered them with hay and an old door. Then he waited again. Next came the daughter, Victoria. Perhaps she went to see what was keeping her parents. She walked into the dark. The mattock swung again, then her 7-year-old daughter, Cecilia. The death of the little girl is the detail that breaks the heart and turns this case from a crime into a nightmare. The autopsy revealed a heartbreaking detail. Young Cecilia did not die instantly. She likely survived for hours in the darkness alongside her family. But the massacre wasn't finished. The killer wiped the mattock and walked into the house. He moved through the silent kitchen, past the stove that was still warm. He entered the maid's room. Maria Baumgartner was likely asleep. She was killed in her bed, never having worked a full day at Hinterkaifeck. Finally, the killer walked into Victoria's bedroom. In the corner, in a small bassinet, lay 2-year-old Joseph. The killer stood over the sleeping baby. There was no struggle, just one final crushing blow that shattered the crib. By midnight, 6 people were dead. The lineage of the Gruber family had been wiped from the earth. The house fell silent, and this is where a normal crime story ends. The killer flees, the bodies are found, the hunt begins. But Hinterkaifeck is not a normal story. The killer didn't leave. April 1st to April 3rd, 1922. The days following the murder are arguably more disturbing than the night of the killing itself. The farm remained active. To the outside world, life at Hinterkaifeck appeared to be continuing as normal. On Saturday morning, the day after the murders, neighbors saw smoke rising from the chimney of the farmhouse. Someone was tending the fire. Someone was cooking. The villagers assumed the Grubers were awake, warming the house against the chill. On Sunday, the family didn't show up for church in Weidhofen. This was unusual, as Victoria was a choir member, but the villagers shrugged it off. Andreas was a strange, antisocial man. Maybe they were sick. Maybe they were just being difficult. On Monday, the postman, Joseph Mayer, arrived at the farm. He knocked on the window. No answer. The dog, a Spitz named Wolf, was usually barking and aggressive, but today the farm was quiet. Mayer left the mail on the windowsill just as he had done on Saturday. When he looked closely, he noticed the mail from Saturday was gone. Someone had opened the window and taken it inside. For 3 days, Friday night, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, someone was living in the farmhouse. The investigation later revealed details that are almost impossible to process. The killer didn't just hide, he made himself at home. He slept in the beds of the people he had just slaughtered. He went into the kitchen and prepared meals. Police found remnants of bread, meat, and dried fruit that had been eaten after the time of death. He used their utensils. He sat in their chairs. But the most chilling detail involves the animals. When the bodies were finally discovered, the police found that the cattle and the pigs were healthy. They weren't starving. The cows' udders were not swollen. They had been milked. The killer had gone out to the barn, the same barn where 4 bodies were rotting under a pile of hay, and he had fed the livestock. He had milked the cows. He maintained the farm's chores with the dedication of a hired hand. There is a specific account from a mechanic named Albert Hoffner. On April 4th, before the bodies were found, Hoffner came to the farm to repair an engine on a food chopper. He stood in the courtyard shouting for the family. No one answered. He heard the dog barking inside the barn. He waited for an hour, feeling an intense, creeping unease. He felt watched. Eventually, he just fixed the engine, which took him a few hours. While he worked, the killer was likely just a few feet away, watching him from behind a curtain or through the cracks in the barn wall. When Hoffner finished, he later said he saw the barn door open and the dog tied up outside. Someone had let the dog out after he arrived. The killer was toying with him. By Tuesday, April 4th, the silence was too loud to ignore. A neighbor named Lawrence Schlittenbauer, a man with a complicated history with the family, decided to investigate. He gathered 2 other men, Jakob Ziegel and Michael Pearl. They walked across the fields to the silent fortress. The farm felt wrong as soon as they stepped onto the property. The dog, Wolf, was now barking frantically from inside the barn. The doors were locked. They broke into the barn. The air was thick with a metallic stench mingled with the smell of animals. Schlittenbauer led the way, holding a lantern. In the dim light, he saw a shape under a pile of hay and an old door near the stable entrance. He pulled the dry grass away. The shock sent the men reeling backward. The bodies were stacked like cordwood. Schlittenbauer, however, reacted strangely. While the other men were paralyzed with horror, Lawrence didn't freeze. He ran toward the house. He unlocked the front door from the inside, proving the killer had locked up before finally leaving. He shouted that he was looking for his son, little Joseph. Inside, the house was warm. It felt lived in. In the maid's room, they found Maria. In the bedroom, the baby Joseph lying in his shattered bassinet. When the Munich police finally arrived, the investigation turned into a circus of incompetence. The crime scene was contaminated almost immediately. Curious villagers walked through the blood. The police officers, hungry from the journey, actually sat in the kitchen and ate food found in the pantry, food that the killer might have prepared. They even slept in the beds where the victims had slept. But even in the chaos, they found clues that deepened the mystery. They found the Mattock hidden in the attic floorboards, wiped clean but still staining the wood. They found a pocket knife that belonged to none of the victims. And they found evidence that someone had been sleeping in the hay in the attic for days before the murder. Tiles had been removed from the roof to create a sniper-like vantage point. The previous maid was right. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched. The killer had been living above their heads, watching them through cracks in the floorboards, learning their habits, waiting for the perfect moment. Who could do this? The brutality suggested a crime of passion, but the aftermath, the feeding of the animals, the staying in the house, suggested a cold, calculated madness. The police interviewed over 100 suspects, but the case remains a maze of dead ends. Suspect 1. Lawrence Schlittenbauer. Suspicion fell heavily on Lawrence Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who found the bodies. He had been a suitor of Victoria Gabriel. They had planned to marry, but Andreas Gruber had forbidden it. It was widely rumored that Schlittenbauer was the father of baby Josef. The theory was that Lawrence snapped. Perhaps he came to the farm to demand custody of his son or to confront Andreas about the incest. A fight broke out, and he killed them all in a rage. The evidence against him was compelling. 1. The dog didn't bark at him, suggesting the animal knew the killer. 2. He knew the layout of the farm perfectly. 3. He seemed unbothered by the sight of the bodies and disturbed the crime scene before police arrived. 4. He later made strange comments, seemingly knowing details about the murders that only the killer would know. However, Schlittenbauer sued anyone who called him a murderer for slander, and he won. The police never found concrete physical evidence linking him to the weapon. Suspect 2. Karl Gabriel. This is the most chilling theory. Karl Gabriel was Victoria's husband, supposedly killed in France in 1914, but his body was never properly identified. It was just a uniform and a dog tag in a mass grave. Soldiers from his unit later told police that Karl had talked about ending his family if he ever got back. He hated the Grubers. He knew about the incest. The theory goes that Karl didn't die. He deserted or was captured and eventually made his way back to Germany. He returned to his farm, hid in the attic, and watched. When he saw his wife with a new baby that couldn't be his, a baby that was likely the product of incest, he exacted his revenge. This would explain why the killer stayed. He wasn't a stranger. He was the master of the house, reclaiming his domain. He felt entitled to the food and the bed. Suspect 3. The Gump brothers. Adolf Gump was a suspected butcher and thief who was rumored to have been in a relationship with Victoria. The theory suggests a robbery gone wrong, but it doesn't hold up. The Grubers were rich. They had gold coins and cash hidden in the house. The killer left it all. He didn't take a single pfennig. This wasn't about money. It was about hate. The investigation took a turn into the bizarre. In a desperate attempt to solve the case, the police took the drastic step of separating the victims' heads from their bodies to be examined. The heads were removed from the bodies and sent to Munich to be examined by clairvoyants. The police hoped the spirits would reveal the killer. They didn't. The skulls were never returned to the bodies. During the chaos of World War II, the skulls of the Gruber family were lost or destroyed. The victims of Hinterkaifeck were buried headless in a single grave in the Weidhofen cemetery, a final act of desecration for a cursed family. In 1923, 1 year after the massacre, the villagers of Weidhofen had had enough. They marched to the farm and tore it down. They demolished the house, the barn, the stables. They wanted to erase the evil from their land. But you cannot erase a story like this. During the demolition, the workers found one last secret. Hidden in the attic, nestled in the hay where the killer had slept, was a stash of gold coins and the murder weapon, the Mattock. The killer had been so confident, so relaxed, that he carefully hid the weapon before leaving. Today, there is nothing left of Hinterkaifeck but a simple shrine in a flat, open field. A wooden cross stands where the barn used to be, surrounded by 2 trees. It is a lonely place. Even in summer, the wind feels colder there. The case remains unsolved. The police files are full of contradictions, lost evidence, and the whispers of a century. Modern profilers who have looked at the case generally agree that the killer was likely someone the family knew, someone with a deep, personal grudge, but the name died with them. The horror of Hinterkaifeck isn't just about the identity of the killer. It's about the vulnerability. We all lock our doors at night to keep the danger out. We build fences, we install alarms, we tell ourselves that inside our homes we are safe. We believe that our walls protect us from the chaos of the world. But the lesson of Hinterkaifeck is that sometimes the lock doesn't matter. Sometimes the danger isn't trying to get in. Sometimes the danger has been inside with you all along, listening to you breathe, watching you eat, waiting for you to close your eyes. So tonight, when you turn off the lights and you hear that faint creak in the ceiling, don't tell yourself it's just the wind, because for the Gruber family, it wasn't.